In the heart of the Rockies, there is a tale that haunts the locals and tourists alike. It's the story of the Skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that can take on the form of any animal or human they desire. The legend says that the Skinwalkers were once humans who made a deal with dark powers, trading their souls for the ability to transform into any being they wished. But as time went on, they lost touch with their humanity and became twisted, evil creatures that preyed on the living. Many who have ventured into the Rockies claim to have seen the Skinwalkers, lurking in the shadows and watching them with eyes that glow in the dark. Some say they have heard their haunting inhuman laughter echoing through the forest, and others claim to have felt their icy breath on their necks. There are stories of hikers who have gone missing without a trace, and others who have been found torn apart and half-eaten. Some say that these were the victims of the Skinwalkers, lured into the forest by their deceptive powers, never to be seen again. The legend of the Skinwalkers continues to terrify those who hear it, a warning that the Rockies are not to be taken lightly. For those who dare to enter, the danger is real, and the consequences can be deadly. Mark and Julia had been living in the bustling city for several years, working long hours at their respective jobs and feeling increasingly disconnected from the natural world. Despite their shared love of hiking and the outdoors, they had found it difficult to find the time and energy to make it happen. However, as they approached their 5th anniversary as a couple, they decided that enough was enough. They resolved to take a break from their busy lives and head out into the wilderness for a few days of hiking and camping. For months, they planned their trip meticulously, poring over maps, reading up on gear and supplies, and dreaming of the rugged landscapes they would soon explore. They both looked forward to the peace and solitude of being away from the noise and distractions of the city. The hike they had planned was set to take 3 days, covering a total of approximately 30 miles. They carefully selected a route that would take them through some of the most stunning scenery the Rockies had to offer. They knew that the trail would be challenging, with steep inclines and rugged terrain, but they were both excited to push themselves and explore the wilderness. Each day of the hike would be a new adventure, with unique challenges and breathtaking vistas. They would carry all of their supplies with them, including food, water, and camping gear, and they planned to spend each night under the stars in a different campsite. Finally, the day arrived, and they set out early in the morning, driving for hours until they reached the trailhead. As they began the hike, Julia's excitement was palpable, and Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and contentment at having made this adventure happen. As they climbed higher and higher, the views became more spectacular, and they marveled at the beauty of the wilderness around them. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the landscape in a warm golden light, and they knew that they were in for a treat. Despite the physical exertion of the hike, they both felt energized and alive, grateful for the chance to escape their everyday lives and reconnect with nature. As the wind howled through the trees and the stars began to twinkle overhead, they settled into their campsite, feeling grateful for each other's company and for the beauty of the world around them. As they settled into their campsite, Mark and Julia took a moment to catch their breath and appreciate the tranquility of the wilderness.
"This is amazing, Mark. The view is breathtaking,"
she said, turning to him with a wide grin. Mark smiled back, his heart warming at the sight of her.
"Yeah, it's beautiful. Just like you."
Julia rolled her eyes but couldn't help but blush at his words.
"Seriously, though, I'm so glad we decided to do this. It's just what we needed."
As the sun began to set and the sky turned a shade of orange, Mark and Julia started a small campfire and began to cook their dinner. But their peaceful evening was interrupted when they heard rustling in the bushes. Suddenly, another hiker emerged from the trail. Mark and Julia looked at each other in confusion as the hiker approached them. He looked like he was stuck in time. His clothes looked like they were centuries old.
"Hey there, folks. Mind if I join you?"
the hiker asked, his voice sounding a little strange. They hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Something about this hiker seemed off, but they didn't want to be rude. They welcomed him and offered him some food.
"Thank you, kind folks,"
the hiker said as he sat down with Mark and Julia.
"I'm afraid I'm not quite used to the company of others these days. I'm more of a solitary wanderer, you see."
His voice was slow and deliberate, and the way he spoke was almost robotic. Mark and Julia couldn't help but feel a little uneasy around him.
You folks seem like nice people.
The hiker continued.
I must say, it's been a long time since I've had a proper conversation with anyone. I suppose I'm a bit out of practice.
Mark and Julia nodded politely, unsure of what to say. The hiker's words were strange, and his mannerisms were even stranger. As the hiker ate his dinner, he spoke in short, stilted sentences. It was almost as if speaking was unnatural for him, like he was struggling to remember how to talk. The hiker looked up from his meal and fixed his gaze on Mark and Julia.
So, what brings you folks out this far into the Rockies?
He asked, his robotic voice sounding a little more natural. Mark and Julia exchanged a quick glance before Mark answered.
Just needed to get away from the city for a bit, you know? Take a break from all the noise and chaos. Plus, the Rockies are just so beautiful. We couldn't resist.
The hiker nodded slowly, his eyes seeming to study them intently.
I see, yes. The wilderness can be a great escape. A chance to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
There was a moment of silence as the hiker continued to study them. Mark and Julia felt uneasy under his gaze.
Well, it was nice to meet you.
Mark said, standing up and beginning to pack away their dinner supplies.
But we should probably get some rest. We have a big day of hiking tomorrow.
The hiker nodded again and stood up as well.
Of course, I understand completely. Don't let me keep you up.
As the hiker continued on his hike and disappeared into the woods, Mark and Julia couldn't help but feel relieved that he was gone. Something about him just didn't sit right with them. Mark and Julia quickly finished cleaning up their campsite and settled into their tent for the night. Despite feeling tired, they both found it difficult to fall asleep after their encounter with the strange hiker. In the middle of the night, Julia woke up to find that Mark was no longer by her side. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, trying to adjust to the darkness of the tent.
Mark?
She called out, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was no response. She reached for her flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam around the tent. Julia's heart was racing as she realized that Mark wasn't in the tent with her. She quickly got dressed and stepped outside, calling out his name.
Mark? Mark, where are you?
She called out, scanning the surrounding area. At first, there was no response, and Julia's panic began to grow. But then she heard Mark's voice, faintly calling out to her from behind a nearby tree.
Julia, come over here. You've got to see this.
Mark's voice said. Relieved that he was okay, Julia started walking towards him.
What is it?
She asked, trying to calm her racing heart. But Julia's relief was short-lived as Mark suddenly appeared from behind her, asking her what was wrong. Confused, Julia turned back to where she thought she had heard Mark's voice, but there was no one there.
I thought I heard you calling me.
She said, still feeling disoriented. Mark looked at her with concern.
What are you talking about? I was just taking a quick bathroom break.
Julia shook her head, still feeling spooked by the experience.
I don't know. I guess it was just my imagination.
They both went back into the tent and tried to go back to sleep, but Julia found it difficult to shake the feeling of unease. As she lay there in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking in the shadows just beyond the tent. Eventually, she managed to drift off to sleep, but it was a restless and uneasy sleep. The next morning, they packed up their campsite and continued on their hike, Julia still feeling on edge from the strange events of the previous night. The second day of the hike was just as beautiful as the first, but Mark and Julia couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled upon them. They walked in silence for most of the morning, lost in their own thoughts and worries. As they continued on the trail, they came across a clearing where they decided to take a break and have some snacks. Julia was eating an apple when she suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up and saw the same hiker they had met the day before, standing on the other side of the clearing and staring at them.
Hey!
Mark called out to him.
What are you doing here?
The hiker didn't respond, but instead just kept staring at them with an intense look in his eyes. Julia could feel her heart racing again, and she instinctively grabbed onto Mark's arm for support. The hiker finally broke his gaze and turned to leave, disappearing into the woods once again. Mark and Julia exchanged a quick glance, both feeling even more uneasy now.
What's the matter with this guy?
Mark said, his voice tense.
Let's pack up and get back on the trail.
Julia nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of relief as they gathered their things and began to walk away from the strange hiker. As they made their way back onto the trail, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He kept turning around to see if the hiker was following them, but there was no sign of him.
I can't stop thinking about the way he was dressed,
Julia said, breaking the silence.
He looked like he was from another time period.
Mark thought back to the hiker's clothing. It was true. The man's outfit was old-fashioned and seemed out of place in the modern world.
Maybe he's some kind of reenactor or something,
he suggested. Julia shrugged.
Yeah, maybe. But his whole demeanor just gave me the creeps.
They continued on their trail, but the encounter with the strange man stayed with them. They couldn't help but feel like they were being watched, even though there was no one else around.
Maybe we should turn back,
Julia said nervously.
I don't feel comfortable continuing on this trail.
Mark considered her suggestion but didn't want to let fear control their decision-making.
Let's just keep going for a little while longer. If we still feel uneasy, we can turn back then.
As they walked, the woods grew darker and the trail became less defined. They stumbled over roots and fallen branches, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the quiet forest. Suddenly they heard another sound, the sound of footsteps coming from behind them. They both turned around, but there was no one there. The woods were silent once again.
Maybe it was just an animal,
Mark said, trying to reassure Julia. But they both knew it wasn't an animal. The footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too human. They quickened their pace, hoping to put some distance between themselves and whoever or whatever was following them. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw him again, the hiker in the old-fashioned clothes. He was standing at the edge of the woods, watching them with a blank expression on his face.
What do you want from us?
Julia called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at them. Mark tried to step forward to get a closer look at the man, but Julia held him back.
Don't go near him,
she whispered. Suddenly, the man disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. Mark and Julia were both shaken by the encounter. They didn't know what to make of the strange hiker, or what his intentions might have been. All they knew was that they wanted to get out of the woods as quickly as possible. They turned around and started to run back the way they had come, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the quiet forest once again. As they ran, they realized they had lost their sense of direction. The trail seemed to have disappeared, and the woods looked different than they did on the way in. The trees were closer together and the foliage was denser.
We're lost,
Julia said, her voice quivering.
We'll find our way back,
Mark said, trying to remain calm.
We just have to keep moving.
They pressed on, trying to remember which way they had come from. But every path they took seemed to lead them deeper into the woods, away from civilization. They ran until their legs gave out, until they collapsed in a heap on the forest floor.
We have to keep going,
Julia said, her voice shaking.
We can't stay here.
They got up, their bodies aching and their hearts pounding. They stumbled through the woods looking for a way out, for any sign of civilization. And then, they saw it. A light in the distance shining through the trees. They ran towards it, not caring if it was a trap or a false hope. But as they got closer, they realized that it was a cabin. A small, isolated cabin in the middle of the woods. They stumbled towards it, pounding on the door, shouting for help. And then, the door opened. A woman stood there, her face lined with age and worry.
What are you doing out here?
She asked, ushering them inside.
Don't you know how dangerous these woods can be?
Mark and Julia collapsed onto the cabin's small couch, gasping for breath.
Thank you,
Julia said, tears streaming down her face. The woman shook her head.
It's nothing. I've been living out here for years, and I know how easy it is to get lost in these woods. I'm just glad I was able to help.
As the adrenaline faded, Mark and Julia realized just how exhausted they were. They were bruised and battered from their run through the woods, and their clothes were torn and muddy. The woman gave them food and water and helped clean their wounds.
You can stay here for the night, and then in the morning I'll show you the way back to the trailhead.
They told the woman about their encounter with the strange hiker. The woman listened intently, her face growing more and more concerned as they spoke. When they finished, the woman's eyes widened.
You were lucky.
She said, her voice trembling.
You were lucky to make it out of there alive.
What do you mean?
Julia asked, her brow furrowed. The woman hesitated, then spoke in a low, hushed voice.
There are things in these woods that most people don't know about.
She said.
Things that are best left undisturbed.
Mark asked. The woman looked around nervously, then leaned in closer.
Skinwalkers.
She whispered.
They're creatures that can take on the form of any being they want. They're fast and they're powerful, and they're not to be trifled with.
Mark and Julia exchanged a skeptical glance.
Skinwalkers,
Julia said.
Are you serious?
The woman nodded, her face grave.
I've seen them. The spirits that roam the woods, cursed beings that shift their forms and stalk the unsuspecting. They possess powers beyond our understanding. Do you know the tale of Thomas, the intrepid explorer from the early 1900s? He was a seasoned woodsman, renowned for his mastery of wilderness survival and navigation. People sought his counsel before embarking on perilous journeys into the untamed Rockies. One fateful summer, Thomas embarked on what seemed like an ordinary hike into the heart of the remote mountains. Armed with his hunting rifle, map and compass, he ventured into the wild unknown, but he never returned. For weeks, desperate search parties scoured the treacherous terrain, but no trace of Thomas could be found. The forest seemed to swallow him whole, concealing the secrets of his mysterious disappearance. As time passed, chilling tales began to emerge from the lips of the local folk. Whispers spoke of a malevolent force at work, a maleficent being known as a Skinwalker, a creature of Navajo legend capable of assuming any form it desired. Some claimed that the Skinwalker had lured Thomas deeper into the woods, using its dark arts to ensnare him, and carried him off to a realm unknown to mortals. Though skeptics scoffed at the notion of such supernatural entities, the more superstitious among us knew better. They believed that Thomas had fallen victim to the vengeful spirit, trapped forever between the worlds of the living and the dead. Despite countless attempts to uncover the truth, Thomas's fate remained shrouded in mystery. The mountains have a way of protecting their secrets, especially when they are safeguarded by the unseen hand of the spirit world. And as I said, I too have a tale to share. A story that comes from my own experiences as a child, long before you were all born. You see, I grew up in a small cabin on the edge of those very same woods. It was a secluded and enchanted place, where the spirits of the land whispered through the rustling leaves. As a child, I spent countless hours exploring the woods, drawn to its secrets and mysteries like a moth to a flame. One day, while wandering deeper into the forest than ever before, I stumbled upon a glimmering, ethereal presence. It was Thomas, or at least what remained of him. He appeared before me as a shadow of his former self. His eyes, once filled with the light of adventure, now held a haunting emptiness. His once robust frame seemed diminished, as if the very essence of life had been drained from him. I sensed that he was trapped, caught in a perpetual state of unrest, unable to find peace. It was as if the spirit world had laid its claim on him, leaving him in a limbo between life and death. I approached him cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of his anguish, the torment of a soul torn from its mortal coil. With my childlike innocence, I reached out to the spectre of Thomas, seeking to offer comfort to the tormented soul. But before I could utter a word, he faded away like mist in the morning sun. He was gone, leaving me bewildered and frightened. From that day forward, I never ventured as deep into the woods again. I felt an unspoken pact with the spirits, a sacred understanding that some secrets were best left undisturbed. The memory of that encounter has stayed with me all these years, and I believe it was a warning, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the realm of the unknown.
Mark and Julia weren't sure what to make of the woman's story. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But the fear in the woman's eyes was real, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, even now. As the woman finished speaking, there was a sudden loud noise outside the cabin. Mark and Julia jumped, their hearts pounding. The woman's face went pale.
What was that?
Julia asked, her voice trembling.
I don't know,
The woman said, her eyes darting towards the door. The three of them huddled together, listening intently. There was no more noise, but the air was thick with tension. Mark tried to peer out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Mark and Julia jumped again, but the woman motioned for them to be quiet. She tiptoed over to the window next to the door and peered out. There was no one there, just the darkness of the woods outside. But just as the woman was about to turn back, she let out a low gasp.
What is it?
Mark asked. The woman turned to face them, her eyes wide with fear.
He's here.
She whispered.
He's come for us.
The sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder and more ominous, and they could hear the sound of something scratching at the door.
What do we do?
Julia whispered, her voice trembling.
We need to get out of here.
Mark replied.
We can't stay here.
But as they looked around the small cabin, they realized that there was no other way out. The windows were barred, and the door was the only exit.
We have to try something.
Julia said, her eyes darting towards the woman.
What do you know about this thing? How do we stop it?
The woman's face was lined with worry.
I don't know.
She said, her voice shaking.
All I know is that it's a powerful spirit, a shapeshifter that can take on the form of any being. It preys on those who enter its territory.
Mark could feel the panic rising in his chest. He had heard stories about skinwalkers before, but he had never believed them to be real. Now, faced with the possibility that one was outside, he wasn't so sure. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as something broke through the window. Mark and Julia screamed, but the woman quickly grabbed a pot of boiling water from the stove and threw it at the beast. To their horror, the pot of boiling water had no effect. It simply shook off the scalding liquid and continued to approach them. The creature was now standing in the middle of the cabin, its glowing eyes fixed on the three of them. Mark and Julia backed away slowly, fear gripping their hearts. Without warning, the creature lunged forward and grabbed the old woman in its powerful jaws. She screamed in terror as the creature disappeared into the night, carrying her away. Mark and Julia were left alone, trembling with terror and unsure of what to do next. They knew they had to get out of the cabin, but they also knew that the Skinwalker was still out there, waiting for them. They searched frantically for a weapon, but all they could find were kitchen knives. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They cautiously opened the door and stepped out into the night. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the forest, and the sounds of the night creatures seemed louder than ever. They could feel the Skinwalker's presence, lurking in the shadows, watching them. They started to run, not knowing where they were going, but desperate to get away. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on them like a living, breathing thing. They stumbled and fell, but they got back up and kept running. Suddenly they heard a loud, piercing howl. It was the Skinwalker, and it was close. They turned and saw it, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, sprinting towards them. They ran faster than they had ever run before, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the Skinwalker was faster. It caught up to them quickly, and before they could react, it was on them. They screamed as its sharp claws tore into their flesh, their blood mixing with the moonlight. As they lay dying on the forest floor, they could see the Skinwalker standing over them, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. They knew they had made a mistake, that they should have never come to this place. But it was too late now. They closed their eyes and waited for the end, knowing that they would never leave this cursed forest alive. The Skinwalker let out a blood-curdling howl, signaling the end of their lives. As they lay there, they could feel their strength slowly ebbing away, their consciousness slipping into an eternal sleep. The forest around them seemed to come alive, with unseen creatures lurking in the shadows. They could hear the whispering of voices, both human and inhuman, taunting and jeering at their fate. They were trapped, caught in a web of malevolent energy that had been woven over centuries of dark magic. Their bodies began to convulse, as if in the grip of an invisible force. Their minds were consumed by a terrifying darkness, a void that threatened to swallow their souls. They screamed, but no sound came out, drowned out by the cacophony of evil around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. Their bodies lay still, lifeless husks on the forest floor. The Skinwalker lingered for a moment, its eyes gleaming with triumph, before it vanished into the night, leaving behind only silence and the echoes of their final screams. Weeks passed, and the search for Mark and Julia intensified. Friends and family refused to give up hope, holding on to the slimmest thread of possibility that they might still be alive. But deep down, they knew the truth. The remains of their loved ones would be found, a painful confirmation of their worst fears. Search parties combed the forest tirelessly. They scoured the underbrush, climbed treacherous slopes, and traversed the rugged terrain, hoping to find any trace of the lost couple. Then, one fateful day, the searchers made a grim discovery. In a remote and desolate part of the forest, scattered across a large area, they found the remains of Mark and Julia. Their bodies bore the unmistakable signs of a savage attack, mangled and torn beyond recognition. It was a horrifying scene that struck fear into the hearts of those who stumbled upon it. News of the tragic fate that had befallen Mark and Julia spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of the local community and beyond. The legend of the Skinwalker grew darker and more foreboding with each retelling. People spoke in hushed whispers, warning others of the dangers that lurked within the depths of the Rockies. The authorities launched an investigation, hoping to bring justice to the victims and uncover the truth behind the mysterious creature that had claimed their lives. But as they delved deeper into the case, they encountered inexplicable obstacles and a series of strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. Rumors circulated that the Skinwalker was still at large, prowling the forests, its insatiable hunger driving it to seek out new victims. Some claimed to have seen its eerie silhouette lurking in the shadows, while others swore they heard its haunting howls piercing through the night. As time went on, the memory of Mark and Julia's tragic fate faded from the public consciousness. The forest became a place of fear and superstition, its twisted secrets hidden beneath a shroud of darkness. The tale of the ill-fated couple served as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lie beyond the realm of human understanding. To this day, the Rockies bear witness to the unending cycle of life and death, where the spirits of the lost ones linger, and the Skinwalker roams in search of its next prey. Those who dare to venture into the depths of the forest are cautioned to tread carefully, for the legacy of Mark and Julia serves as a haunting reminder that some secrets are best left undisturbed, and some horrors are beyond human comprehension.